She's cold in bed. My husband told the whole family. On his birthday, I revealed the real reason for our lack of intimacy and turned their laughter into absolute silence. The air in the Taylor household was thick with the scent of roasted chicken, buttered biscuits, and the kind of passive-aggressive warmth only family gatherings could produce. Megan Taylor, 34 years old and poised as ever, sat at the end of the long dining table with smiles stitched tightly across her face. It was Josh's birthday, her husband of 8 years, and every member of his family had come to celebrate. His parents, his older brother and his wife, his younger sister with her 3 unruly kids, and an aunt who insisted on narrating every moment like it was a cooking show. Megan had prepared most of the meal herself. Even though her back ached and her stomach had started its usual dull cramping hours earlier, she moved through the day like a hostess on autopilot, attentive, graceful, tired beyond words. She had grown accustomed to masking discomfort with charm. It was second nature by now. The laughter had been loud all afternoon, fueled by wine and old family jokes that excluded Megan by default. She didn't mind. Not anymore. Her relationship with Josh had changed over the years, turning into something colder, more mechanical. They rarely touched. Conversations had narrowed to to-do lists and bills. Still, she played the part. Then came the moment, quick and cruel. They had just finished cutting the cake. The kids were licking frosting off their fingers, and the adults were halfway through another round of wine when Josh, standing beside his chair, launched into an impromptu toast. "Thanks, everyone," he said, voice already slurring slightly. "You all made this great. Seriously, 38 feels pretty good when you're surrounded by people who love you." A chorus of cheers followed. Megan lifted her glass, but didn't drink. Josh grinned, then gestured toward her. "And to my lovely wife, Megan, who made all this happen. Even if she's, well, let's just say, cold in bed." He laughed, throwing his head back like it was the punchline of a joke he had been saving all day. There was a pause, the kind that comes before people decide whether it's okay to laugh. And then they did, loudly. His brother let out a bark. The aunt cackled. Even his mother chuckled behind her wine glass, whispering something to her daughter-in-law that made her smirk. Megan didn't move, her cheeks flushed with heat, but she kept her smile. Not wide, just enough. Her fingers clenched slightly around the stem of her glass. No one noticed, or if they did, they didn't care. Josh sat back down, clearly proud of himself. For a moment, the room continued as if nothing had happened, but something in Megan had shifted. Deep down, something quiet and powerful. Not rage, not sorrow, something simpler. A realization that she was done pretending. She stayed through dessert. She listened to the aunt describe her new neighbor's boyfriend and helped clean up while Josh slipped outside to smoke with his brother. Megan stacked plates and wiped counters. Her movements were efficient, practiced. She laughed when expected. She made excuses when she needed to. But inside, a storm had begun to gather. By the time the last car pulled away and the porch light dimmed, the silence in the house had grown heavy. Josh had collapsed on the couch, flipping through channels as if nothing had happened. Megan stood in the kitchen doorway, watching him. His shirt was wrinkled, his shoes still on. He looked comfortable, at ease. She felt like a ghost in her own home. She walked upstairs without a word, changed into her pajamas, and sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands trembled slightly, but her mind was clear. She wasn't angry. Not yet. What she felt was harder to name, something between humiliation and clarity. Josh's words had hurt, not just because they were cruel, but because they revealed how little he understood or cared to understand. He had turned her private struggle into a cheap laugh, and everyone had played along. For years, Megan had buried her truth beneath politeness and shame. She had endured pain, disappointment, and silence, telling herself it was easier not to explain, that the world didn't need her story, that no one would believe or care. But tonight, in front of those who had laughed, she realized silence had protected no one, least of all herself. She got up, walked to the bathroom, and stared at her reflection under the harsh white light. Her eyes looked tired, older, but they were steady, strong. A line had been crossed, and Megan was ready to stop pretending. The morning after the birthday gathering dawned gray and indifferent. Rain whispered against the window panes, and Megan lay awake long before her alarm, her body still beneath the covers, but her mind pacing like a prisoner. Josh had left early for work, muttering something about meetings and traffic, his tone brisk and forgettable. He had not mentioned the toast, nor the laughter it stirred, and certainly not the aftermath left behind like shattered glass hidden in a carpet. Megan hadn't expected an apology. She had stopped expecting much from him a long time ago. The house was still. Megan got up slowly, her muscles stiff, her abdomen already starting to throb with a dull ache that came and went like a tide. She moved through her routine without thinking, brushing her teeth, tie her hair back, pulling on her leggings and sweatshirt. But her movements were deliberate today. Not mechanical, but intentional. Every step a quiet refusal to crumble. Downstairs, she settled at the kitchen table with a cup of herbal tea, letting its steam rise into her face. She didn't check her phone, didn't open her laptop, didn't turn on the news. Instead, she let the silence stretch around her, wrapping herself in it like armor. For the first time in a long while, Megan allowed herself to remember, fully and without interruption. It had started almost a decade ago, not long after their honeymoon. Back then, the pain was sporadic, almost easy to dismiss. A cramp here, a sharp pinch there. Doctors told her it was normal, hormonal, temporary. She believed them, wanted to believe them. She still had dreams of starting a family, of building a life with Josh that didn't involve calendars marked with red ink or appointments with unfamiliar specialists. But the pain didn't go away. It worsened, subtly at first, then brutally, the kind that woke her in the middle of the night, curled her inward like a dying leaf, left her breathless and clutching at sheets. There were days she could barely stand up straight, when even walking felt like dragging herself through quicksand. Intimacy became complicated, then impossible. And with every new test came a new kind of frustration. Inconclusive results, vague reassurances, doctors who shrugged and handed her pamphlets as if they were answers. By the third year of their marriage, Megan had begun to disappear, not just from Josh's life, but from her own. She smiled through dinner parties, hosted holiday events, helped plan baby showers for friends, all while hiding heating pads beneath her clothes and swallowing painkillers in bathroom stalls. She learned to speak less, to deflect more. Josh had asked questions in the beginning, but as the answers became repetitive, as her explanations turned into apologies, he withdrew. What began as concern slowly transformed into annoyance. Eventually, he stopped asking. She had considered telling his family. Once, after a particularly invasive surgery left her bedridden for 2 weeks, she almost called his mother, thinking perhaps some context would soften the constant comments about grandchildren and fixing what's wrong in the bedroom. But shame always won. It told her she was defective, that talking about it would make her look weak, dramatic, or worse, broken. So she kept quiet, and silence became the default. Until now. She took another sip of her tea and glanced at the corner of the kitchen where Josh's keys usually hung. They weren't there. He had taken them, of course, but the empty hook felt symbolic, a placeholder for something that used to be reliable, something now routinely missing. Later that day, Megan drove to her OB/GYN's office for a follow-up appointment she had scheduled weeks earlier. The waiting room was bright and cold, filled with soft music and the faint scent of antiseptic. She recognized a nurse who greeted her kindly, but didn't remember her name. That happened often. Faces remembered her, but she rarely returned the favor. There were too many appointments, too many white coats, too many explanations that led nowhere. Dr. Ellison, a middle-aged woman with gentle hands and weary eyes, flipped through Megan's file with the kind of practiced calm that made it hard to tell good news from bad. "Your results are consistent," she said. "The endometrial growth is persistent but stable. No signs of malignancy." However, Megan already knew the however. She had heard it before in different tones and variations. "However, we can try a new hormone therapy. However, you may need another laparoscopic procedure. However, you should consider pain management as a long-term strategy." This time, she didn't ask for alternatives. She didn't ask for comfort either. Dr. Ellison looked up. "Have you thought more about support? There are groups, therapy, I've been thinking about speaking to my husband's family, Megan interrupted, her voice even. About all of it. I think it's time. The doctor blinked, then nodded. That's a brave choice. Megan didn't respond. She didn't feel brave. She felt exhausted. But exhaustion, she realized, had become her fuel. By the time she returned home, the sky had darkened. Rain had stopped, leaving behind slick streets and puddles that reflected the fractured light of passing cars. She parked, sat for a moment in the quiet of her vehicle, then got out. Inside, she opened her laptop and began typing an invitation, a casual message to Josh's family, inviting them for a small get-together later that week. Just to toast his birthday again, she wrote, and say thank you properly. She didn't run the message by Josh. She didn't ask his opinion. She clicked send, and as the messages began to deliver, one by one, a quiet resolve settled in her chest. Not fire, not fury, just certainty. It was time for them to hear the truth. Thursday came with an unseasonable warmth in the air, as if the city of Atlanta was offering Megan a strange, silent encouragement. The invitation she had sent 3 days earlier had been met with prompt replies. Everyone was coming. No one asked why there was a second gathering for Josh's birthday, especially so soon after first. Megan suspected they simply assumed it was another chance for drinks and laughter, perhaps an attempt to smooth over the awkwardness of Josh's offhand comment. If they had registered her silence that day, they hadn't let on. That suited her perfectly. The day before the event, Megan had spent hours rehearsing in her head what she would say. She didn't write it down. She didn't want it to sound like a performance. She didn't want it to be polished. She wanted it to be true, even if her voice trembled, especially if it did. Josh had remained oblivious to her intentions. He assumed the gathering was a spontaneous show of goodwill, and while he was slightly puzzled by her initiative, he welcomed it. Nice of you to put this together, he had said while checking his reflection in the hallway mirror. Maybe they'll stop giving you grief for being so distant. He laughed lightly and kissed her on the cheek, not noticing the way she flinched. She spent the day preparing the house, not just for guests, but for herself. She cleaned with precision, as if clearing physical space would somehow calm the emotional chaos she carried. In the kitchen, she arranged appetizers on platters, chilling bottles of champagne she had bought that morning. The living room was lit softly, candles flickering near the windows, their warm glow making the space feel more intimate, almost sacred. Megan wore a navy blue dress with long sleeves and flat shoes. Comfortable, confident, unapologetic. The first knock came just after 6. Josh's sister, Bethany, entered with her husband and children, smiling brightly and balancing a tray of store-bought cupcakes. Just in case there's no dessert this time, she joked. Megan received them with practiced ease. Soon after, the others trickled in. His parents, his older brother Tyler and his wife, the aunt who always talked too loudly. Josh poured drinks. Megan greeted each person calmly, noting their expressions. Open, unguarded, unsuspecting. They all assumed they were there for him. As glasses were filled and small talk bubbled through the room, Megan stood slightly apart, observing the dynamic. Josh, holding court in the corner, recounted some office anecdote to his father. The kids had wandered into the den, where the television was playing a muted animated movie. Bethany and the aunt were already gossiping about a neighbor's divorce, the usual tone of mock concern masking their delight. At 7:30, when everyone had a drink in hand and the noise had reached its usual social hum, Megan stepped into the center of the room. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Can I have everyone's attention?" she said, glass in hand, her voice clear and composed. The room stilled. Conversations halted. All eyes turned to her. Josh looked up, surprised but intrigued, already half smiling, as if expecting a tribute in his honor. "I wanted to say something," she began, her tone calm, her posture upright. "After last week, I realized there's something I've been hiding for far too long, and I don't want to hide it anymore." A flicker of confusion passed across a few faces. Josh's smile dimmed slightly, his brow furrowing. When Josh made a joke at lunch last weekend, a lot of you laughed. Some of you texted me afterward with advice, suggestions, or teasing comments. I'm sure none of you meant harm. she said, letting the sentence hang in the air just long enough to settle. But what you didn't know is that the topic of that joke, my so-called coldness, isn't about neglect or apathy. It's about pain. Bethany shifted uncomfortably. Josh's mother lowered her glass. For years, Megan continued, I've been living with a condition called endometriosis. It's chronic. It's invasive. It causes intense, unpredictable pain. It affects my body, my energy, my mood, my fertility. And yes, it affects intimacy. But it's not about being cold. It's about surviving something that's invisible to most people. The silence was heavy now. A few people looked away. One of the children had wandered in from the den and stood at the doorway, sensing the weight in the room but not understanding it. I've seen over a dozen specialists. I've had surgeries, hormone treatments, dietary restrictions, physical therapy. Some days, I can barely get out of bed. Other days, I pretend everything's fine just to avoid judgment or pity. But what hurts most is when my suffering becomes a punchline, especially from someone who knows how hard I've tried to pretend otherwise. She didn't look at Josh when she said it, but everyone else did. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His face was pale, confused, almost childlike in its disbelief. I've kept quiet because I was ashamed, because I didn't want to be seen as weak or broken or difficult. I've made myself small in this family, trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me. But tonight, I'm done with silence. No one moved. The air in the room had thickened, as though we're bearing the weight of all the years she compressed into those few minutes. I'm not saying this for sympathy, she added, her voice softening. I'm saying it because truth matters, and I deserve to be seen for who I am, not who people assume I should be. She raised her glass to truth, even when it's uncomfortable. A few glasses were lifted in reply, hesitant, slow. Megan took a small sip, then placed her drink on a nearby table. Thank you for coming, she said quietly. I hope you all have a good night. Then she turned and walked out of the living room, leaving the murmurs and stares behind her. The hallway felt longer than usual, but her steps were steady. Upstairs, she closed the door to the bedroom and sat on the edge of bed, her heart pounding but steady. She felt raw, unprotected, but she also felt powerful. And this time, she wasn't waiting for applause. Downstairs, the silence Megan had left behind lingered like smoke after a fire. The guests stood motionless for several seconds after she exited, some still holding their glasses midair, as if unsure whether they were expected to drink or simply lower their arms. It was Bethany who moved first, clearing her throat and walking over to set her drink on the nearest surface. She didn't speak. No one did. Josh remained rooted in place, a growing tightness around his eyes, as though trying to make sense of what had just unfolded without acknowledging what it meant. His mother, Judith, finally broke the stillness, though her voice was little more than a whisper. I didn't know, she murmured to no one in particular. I thought, but she didn't finish. Whatever she had assumed clearly no longer applied. Her husband stood beside her, his expression unreadable, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Tyler shifted his weight, shooting a glance at his wife, who looked embarrassed, less for Megan, more for herself. She had laughed the loudest last week, and now that laughter felt like a stain she couldn't wash away. The aunt began muttering something about how no one had told her it was serious, as if her ignorance could serve as a shield from guilt. Josh's face was drained of color. His hand still curled slightly, as if grasping a memory that wouldn't stay still. He looked toward the staircase but didn't move. He could still hear her voice echoing in his head, those last words, spoken not with malice, but with unshakable certainty. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even anger. It was a statement of truth, laid bare in front of everyone he had grown up with, and he had nothing to counter it with. Nothing that wouldn't make him look smaller than he already felt. The party dissolved soon after that, though no one called a party anymore. People began gathering their coats and murmuring vague goodbyes. No one approached the staircase. No one asked to speak with Megan. Their departure was quiet, almost reverent, as if they were leaving a wake rather than a birthday toast. Judith lingered the longest, hovering near the door, her eyes drifting toward the living room before finally turning away. Josh didn't speak until the house was empty, He moved slowly, his movement stiff with uncertainty, and sank into the couch. The champagne bottles remained mostly untouched on the table, their condensation collecting in small pools. He sat in the quiet for several minutes, not turning on the television, not picking up his phone. For the first time in years, Josh was truly alone in his own house, and the weight of that realization was suffocating. Upstairs, Megan remained on the edge of the bed, listening to the sounds of the house, as if they could tell her what the silence could not. She could tell when the last guest left, could feel the sudden stillness when the front door clicked shut. She didn't expect Josh to come up right away. Maybe not at all, but she didn't care, not in the bitter way of someone nursing resentment, but in the calm detachment of someone who has finally relinquished the responsibility of managing another person's discomfort. When he eventually appeared in the doorway, she didn't look up. She was already in her robe, seated at the vanity, removing her earrings with slow, deliberate fingers. He leaned against the frame, unsure what to do with his hands. "I didn't know," he said finally. She didn't turn. "You didn't want to?" He swallowed hard. "That's not fair." Megan turned then, her face neutral but not cold. "You think fairness is a point?" Josh stepped further into the room, each movement a negotiation. "Why didn't you tell them before?" "I didn't owe them anything," she replied calmly. "But I owed myself the truth, and I owed you the chance to hear it without pretending it didn't matter." "I wasn't trying to hurt you," he said, his voice low, almost childlike. "It was a joke." She met his eyes. "Your joke was built on a lie I've been forced to carry alone. That's not funny." He looked away, running a hand through his hair. "I guess I've just been frustrated." "I know," she said, "but I was in pain. There's a difference." Josh sat down at the edge of the bed, facing the floor. The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was honest, raw, and heavy with a shared sense of failure. Megan didn't move to console him, and he didn't reach for her. They simply sat, two people finally acknowledging a distance that hadn't appeared overnight, but had been growing quietly for years. "I should have been there," he said after a long pause. "You still can be," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "But that starts with listening, not fixing, not joking, just listening." He nodded slowly, more to himself than to her. That night, they didn't speak much more. Megan slept lightly, her body accustomed to restlessness, her mind cautious. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel like a guest in her own life. The next morning, Megan woke to a house that felt subtly different. The light through the blinds was gentler, the air less stifling. She found a note on the kitchen counter in Josh's handwriting. It read, simply, "Therapist, Saturday. I'll go if you go." She stood there for a long time, the paper in her hand, feeling something begin to stir. Not trust, not yet, but a beginning, a door that had remained locked for too long, now slightly open. And this time, she would walk through it on her own terms. The therapy office was modest, tucked into a quiet corner of Midtown, far enough from the rush of downtown to feel like neutral ground. Megan arrived 10 minutes early, as she always did for appointments of any significance. She parked, took a moment to breathe behind the wheel, then stepped out into the cool Saturday morning. The sky was pale, stretched thin across the horizon, the kind of morning that offered no promise, but carried no threat either, an in-between space, appropriate for what lay ahead. Josh arrived on time, his car pulling in beside hers without fanfare. He didn't wave as he got out, nor did she, but where he approached, there was no tension in his steps, only a quiet restraint. He wore jeans and a jacket she hadn't seen in years, the collar slightly frayed. He looked like a man who'd spent several days thinking more than speaking. Inside, the therapist greeted them with a nod and gestured to two chairs angled toward one another. The session began without ceremony. Josh shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Megan crossed her legs and kept her gaze steady. She wasn't nervous. She was tired of being nervous. The therapist, a woman named Clarice, with gray hair pulled into a bun and a voice that settled like dust, asked them to speak freely, not about the past and sweeping generalities, but about the now, about what they wanted from each other and from themselves. Josh started hesitantly, his voice uneven, as if testing each word for balance before releasing it. "I don't think I ever understood how much space I took up," he said, eyes focused on the floor. "I was so focused on feeling rejected, I didn't think about what I was rejecting in return." Clarice nodded but didn't interrupt. Megan remained quiet, letting his words land without interruption or indulgence. "I was hurt," he continued, "and instead of dealing with that, I made it her problem. I turned my discomfort into blame. I laughed because I didn't know what else to do with the truth I was avoiding." Megan's voice, when it came, was soft but unyielding. "I never wanted you to fix me. I just wanted you to sit with me, even if it was messy, even if it was painful." Josh nodded slowly. "I didn't know how." Clarice interjected gently. "And now?" He looked up then at Megan, his expression stripped of ego. "Now I want to learn." The session didn't resolve everything. It wasn't supposed to. But when they left, there was a sense of forward motion. Not hope exactly, but potential. They walked back to their cars in silence. Josh paused before opening his door. "Coffee?" he asked, with no expectation in his tone. Megan nodded once. Somewhere quiet. They found a small cafe near the park and sat outside, surrounded by potted plants and the quiet murmur of morning regulars. Conversation was sparse but honest. They didn't rehash the therapy session. Instead, they spoke about mundane things, the upcoming week, a friend's wedding, a new restaurant Megan wanted to try. For the first time in a long while, the silence between them wasn't strained. It was simply a place where words could breathe. Over the next few weeks, they continued attending therapy. Some sessions were harder than others. Megan had days when she didn't want to explain anything anymore, when she was drained from revisiting old wounds. Josh had moments of defensiveness, of trying to rationalize his past instead of facing it. But slowly, a new language began to form between them, one that allowed for discomfort without dismissal, one that didn't require her to shrink to make room for him. Megan also began taking more time for herself. She joined a local support group for women with chronic illness, something she had resisted for years. It was strange at first, sitting in a room with strangers and sharing pieces of herself that she had kept buried. But over time, those meetings became a place of solace, a reminder that her pain didn't exist in a vacuum. She also started writing again, not for anyone else, not for a blog or publication, but for herself. Late at night, after the house was quiet, she would open her notebook and let the words pour out. Sometimes it was a letter to her body, other times a memory she needed to make peace with. The act of writing was not about catharsis or closure, but about reclamation, her story in her voice. Josh, for his part, made changes too. He began cooking dinner once a week, clumsy but earnest in his efforts. He read articles Megan shared with him about endometriosis, not just to understand the condition, but to understand her. He stopped making assumptions, stopped offering solutions, and started asking questions instead. Small things, but meaningful. One evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the sky shift from lavender to navy, Josh reached for her hand, not out of obligation, but out of presence. Megan didn't pull away. She didn't lean in either. She simply let their hands rest together, still and open. She had forgiven him, not with a grand declaration, but with a series of quiet choices. But forgiveness didn't mean erasure. It meant acknowledgement. It meant building something new with full awareness of what had once been broken. Months later, Megan stood before a mirror, adjusting the neckline of her dress before heading to a family dinner. Josh waited downstairs, the car keys in hand, their dynamic redefined but not forced. That night, Judith greeted her with a long hug. No words. Bethany offered to help in the kitchen, her tone softer than usual. The family didn't talk about the toast, about the night the illusion cracked. But Megan didn't need them to. Their silence had changed shape, no longer avoidance, but respect. As dessert was served, a niece tugged on Megan's sleeve and asked why she didn't have children. The room froze for a second, everyone bracing. Megan knelt at the girl's level and smiled. Some people's bodies work differently, she said. Mine tells stories in other ways. The child nodded, satisfied, and ran off. Megan stood, her eyes meeting Josh's across the table. He gave her a look that asked nothing and offered everything. And for the first time in years, she felt not just understood, but whole.